Expectations can be something that motivates us, but can also be quite a dangerous thing if we let it decide whether we're happy or not based on the expectations of other people, right? We talked about in a last video about the bird, the swamp pheasant, not wanting to be kept in a cage, right? The commander of the right who lost his foot in the war and is asked, was it heaven or man that made you one-footed? And this man said, it was heaven, not man, because he refused to be tethered by the schemings, the workings of men. I feel that pottery is a very similar thing. Some people make pottery for utilitarian purposes, a vessel that can do something, or that is meant to do something. And then some people make decorative things or sculptural things that really don't serve a purpose other than the aesthetic purpose of looking at and appreciating it, similar to a painting. We wouldn't use a painting as a dinner plate per se, but we would look at it. And the assumption is that we're supposed to enjoy it by looking at it. And this art form, pottery, which is so varied, really similar to all art, strikes people in very different ways. And you never know what someone will appreciate and another would see as garbage. And that is precisely the differences of expectations similar to something's perhaps objective beauty or use to itself in its own preservation. Hello, my friends. My name is Spencer. I'm a maker, and I love stories. Today we're going to be focusing on a section of the Zhuangzi, I believe section 18, titled Zhi, which is the pinnacle of happiness, supreme happiness. And I'll be referencing the Burton Watson translation, my favorite Zhuangzi translation, with a very sort of disembodied aspect of this chapter that I see as at least what struck me as the most important part of this chapter. When Zhuangzi happens upon an old skull, and in his sleep will speak to it. So first I'm going to just read this very short section, and then I'd love to talk about it. When Zhuangzi went to Chu, he saw an old skull, all dry and parched. He poked it with his carriage whip and then asked, "Sir, were you greedy for life and forgetful of reason, and so came to this? Was your state overthrown, and did you bow beneath the axe, and so came to this? Did you do some evil deed, and were you ashamed to bring disgrace upon your parents and family, and so came to this? Was it through the pangs of cold and hunger that you came to this? Or did your springs and autumns pile up until they brought you to this?" When he had finished speaking, he dragged the skull over and, using it for a pillow, lay down to sleep. In the middle of the night, the skull came to him in a dream and said, "You chatter like a rhetorician, and all your words betray the entanglements of a living man. The dead know nothing of these. Would you like to hear a lecture on the dead?" "Indeed," said Zhuangzi. The skull said, "Among the dead there are no rulers above or subjects below, and no chores of the four seasons. With nothing to do, our springs and autumns are as endless as heaven and earth. A king facing south on his throne could have no more happiness than this." Zhuangzi couldn't believe this and said, if I got the arbiter of fate to give you a body again, make some bones and flesh, return you to your parents and family and your old home and friends, would you want that? You would want that, wouldn't you? The skull frowned severely, wrinkling up its brow. Why would I throw away more happiness than that of a king on a throne and take on the troubles of human beings again, it said. So this section is very powerful. We have a skull. We must suspend our disbelief that the skull is speaking, right? But it is a dead person who has lived some sort of life, and we don't know what that life was. Zhuangzi only speculates. And yet, given the opportunity to return to life as it was, it denies this, saying that now all things are beautiful. So on the surface, we could take this as a very nihilistic and annihilationist mindset of what's the point of life? Death might be better. But according to everything that Zhuangzi has said up until now, it seems it couldn't be that. At least this is my take. But rather, it is to say that death is not an end, but a transformation. Zhuangzi often talks about transformation of things. In his most famous text, where we have the Zhuangzhou Mengdie, the dream of the butterfly, where Zhuangzhou falls asleep, dreams he's a butterfly, wakes up and is solid and unmistakable Zhuangzhou, and did not know whether he was Zhuangzhou who dreamt he was a butterfly, or now a butterfly dreaming that he's Zhuangzhou. And he says between all of this there must be some distinction, and this is what we call the transformation of things. So there is a innate dreamlike dualism that occurs in Daoist thought, or rather is recognized in Daoist thought as the way that people view the entire world. And that, I think, is directly tied to the expectations that people have over other people. To the point where the way one should live one's life, if you let someone decide that for you, someone else will be living through you, and it will not be organically and authentically you. And even to the limits of life and death. That even in chapter 3, we talked about this when Lao Dan died, and Qin Shi went to mourn for him. He says, if you are content with the coming of people into your life and the leaving, the following along, then grief and joy have no way to enter you. And so too, if we cease to view death as something awful, and rather an inevitable and necessary aspect of the lived experience, then that not only is what made life so precious in its ephemerality, its finity, but also makes it not such a bad thing per se, but rather just a continuance of the living process. I think that whether the skull is experiencing great things in a question mark afterlife, according to the Zhuangzi, is sort of an irrelevant aspect of this chapter, but more so that the lived world is filled with toil and suffering. And to make distinctions such as good or bad, and perhaps even life and death, as something completely separate, would cause us to cling and attach to life and even all of the trappings and sufferings that come with it. Now, whether this is right or wrong to do is not something I'm going to tackle, at least in this video, but rather we have two differing opinions. We have a living man who is tethered to expectations of the way that life is. And Zhuangzi puts himself in that role. He could have put anybody, but instead, you see, he's the one who prodded the skull with his horsewhip. And he's the one who seems to be sort of the naive party in this dialogue. And the skull seems to know more. He knows something Zhuangzi does not. And these values that people often put into their own lives, which definitely drives progress forward, but also causes a great deal of pain, are things such as ambition, duty, hierarchical thinking, values of common society that are not at all of the concern of this skull. And when we are born, there is only one thing that we know about our lives, which is that one day it will end. And knowing that and accepting that, though incredibly difficult, and accepting the impermanence and the constant state of flux that we are occupying, this weird liminal space between birth and death that we value so much and is all we really know, is something that causes us great joy and great grief, highs and lows. But who's to say that it is bad or good? We have two different opinions. So what I've decided to do is carve this skull, a human skull, after this skull in the chapter of Supreme Happiness, and make it sort of haloed. I'm quite happy with how it turned out. And because we are approaching Halloween, spooky season, I decided to make several more mugs of different animal skulls with the same general theme. And I hope you like it. And I hope that wherever you are, or whenever you might be encountering this video, that you can sit still and meditate for a moment on what is that thing that you are suffering over because of the expectations of others. And is it, in fact, a required suffering, or is it needless? Is a question I'd love for all of us to ask ourselves, because it might liberate us in some small measure. So it's been a pleasure talking about this chapter. And I hope that you will read some on your own. Have a wonderful day.